So it's going really well so far. I think we did lose a bunch of people when we went into the poster sessions. Right. I can see a few of the poster presenters are back in here. I'm not sure how many people got around to those posters, but I think part of the problem is moving from one Zoom room to another isn't so easy. You have to exit Zoom and then click on a URL to get back in.
Right. I see that you follow the trend, the male trend of the COVID era, the beard.
Oh, yes. Yes, it's
around here in Switzerland. It's amazing how many people have acquired beards.
It's yes. Well, my one daughter wants me to keep it. The other two want me to shave it. So we'll see what happens.
Right.
The ANU has reopened, so when I get back into the office, I might have to get out the razor. Right. Okay, we're starting to build up people again. I might just
see that. I see Richard. Yeah, I think he's muted. I'm not sure he hears me. Hello, and he fled Switzerland just at the right time.
Yes. Well, we've been up. Well, I've been up since 2 a.m. It's now 7 a.m. in Australia. Dylan as well. So
right.
It's been a long night for us, but there's been a bunch of very, very good talks, and we're looking forward to 3 more invited talks. So maybe we can get going with the session. We've got so Pascal Foix, who's coming up next. Subransu Maji, I see is online now. Who'll be talking afterwards, and Zico was online earlier. I'm not sure if he's back online, but he should be online before his talk. Okay, so we'll start the second session of invited talks. It's the last session of the workshop. So the first speaker is Professor Pascal Foix. So Pascal received his engineering degree from Paris in 1984 and a PhD in computer science from the university. Who muted me?
So sorry, I accidentally muted you trying to mute Richard.
Right, okay. All right, where was I? I was introducing Pascal. So Pascal's research interests include shape modeling and motion recovery from images, analysis of microscopy images, and augmented reality. He's co-authored a very large number of publications, over 300 publications. He's an IEEE fellow and an associate editor of PAMI. And today he's going to talk on deep surface meshes. I have a pre-recording of the talk that I'll play, but Pascal is online and will be available for answering questions. So let me just tee up the talk. And
I would like to present our work on making the most out of deep networks when trying to model 3D surfaces as targeted meshes. Of course, we beg the question of why we would want to use meshes, given that there are many kinds of surface representations that may be easier to incorporate into a deep learning pipeline. Surfaces can be voxelized, represented by point clouds or by truncated meshes. All these representations have their pluses and minuses, but truncated meshes are particularly well suited when we need to represent high-frequency details, which is one of the reasons they have been so popular for so long. This is definitely the case in computer graphics when accurate renderings are required. This is also true in biomedical imaging when we need to compute the surface areas of specific structures, or in computational fluid dynamics when we want to represent boundary conditions. Unfortunately, it is not obvious how to design and train a deep network to produce such meshes with arbitrary numbers of vertices and topology. This is the problem I would like to address in this talk. The Pix2Mesh algorithm that was presented at ICCV last year was designed with this purpose in mind. It starts from an image and outputs a mesh. In our own work, we have extended it to take a volume as input instead. In both cases, the input is encoded into a latent representation and then decoded into a mesh. This gives good results, but they can be further improved by using a two-stream architecture that decodes both to a mesh and to a volumetric representation, with intermediate connections between the two decoder streams to ensure they truly operate in tandem. These three examples feature CT, MRI, and EM data volumes. In all three cases, our approach yields smooth surfaces with far fewer artifacts than UNet, with or without post-processing, which we use as a baseline. This is a step in the right direction, but this approach still relies on deforming an initially spherical shape and can therefore not handle topology changes. It has long been known that a natural way to do so is to use an implicit surface representation instead of an explicit one. And last year, deep sign fields, or SDFs, have emerged as a great tool to harness the power of implicit surfaces in the deep learning context. This has generated an enormous amount of interest, and I'd like to briefly summarize how SDFs work before presenting our own use of them. A volumetric SDF is a function from R3 into R that assigns to a point X a value that is assigned distant to the surface. Their great strength is that the zero crossings of the surface can change topology while the function itself changes continuously and differentiably. Until recently, their perceived limitation was that storing the value of a 3D function was so memory intensive that surfaces could only be modeled at very low resolutions. That perception was changed last year by one key insight. There is no need to store the values of the SDF explicitly. A deep network, denoted as f theta here, can be trained to estimate its value at any point xted. This means that the target surface can be sampled at any resolution. Furthermore, the deep network can take as input, in addition to the point x, a code C that conditions its behavior. As a result, changing C, changing the surface shape, and C becomes de facto a low-dimensional latent vector that can parameterize the surface, and this parameterization is differentiable. However, one bottleneck remains. If an explicit surface representation is required, one has to use a marching cube algorithm, which is not differentiable and makes it difficult to incorporate this representation into an end-to-end trainable pipeline. To see where the problem lies, let us consider a loss function L that depends on the vertices and facets of a 3D triangulation, and let us assume that the surface it represents is parameterized implicitly by the network f theta, like the one we presented in the previous slide. To compute V and F, we can run a marching cube algorithm, which is fine during the forward pass. However, we cannot easily compute the gradient of L during the backward pass because the output of marching cubes is not differentiable. To do it, we must instead exploit an important property of sign distance functions. Given a true distance function, S, and an infinitesimal perturbation delta S of it, the point on the surface will move in direction normal to the surface, which is also the gradient of S. We can therefore prove that the derivative of a vertex location is the gradient of S at that location. And since f theta closely approximates a sign distance function, for each vertex, we can approximate the derivative of dv over df by the gradient of f, which makes the whole loss differentiable. Because the loss is now differentiable, we can minimize using a gradient-based technique. This enables us to start from the sphere on the left side and turn it into the torus on the right. At each iteration, we start with a code C, use the marching cube algorithm to compute the vertices, use them to perform the forward and backward pass as discussed, and finally, take a gradient step and iterate. In this scheme, the non-differentiability of marching cube becomes irrelevant because it is only used to compute surface samples. I would now like to show how this works in practice on two different applications. First, single view reconstruction, and then shape optimization. Given a set of 3D shapes, such as those from the ShapeNet or Pic3D datasets, we can train a ResNet 50 to extract codes from rendered images of these shapes. The resulting codes then become inputs to the SDF F theta, which has been trained to regress the 3D shapes. A previously unseen image containing a target object can be fed to the encoder, resulting in an initial code C that is decoded into a 3D shape that roughly matches the object outline. We can then exploit the differentiability of the loss function to refine C and maximize the overlap between the 3D predicted shape's projection and the true object outline. We feed as input to the encoder an image I of a chair from the Pic3D dataset. The encoder returns a code C0, which decodes the rough shape to the right of I. We then optimize C to maximize the overlap between the real chair and the projection of the predict one. The final result on the right is an accurate model. And, as can now be seen at the bottom of the slide on two additional examples, our reconstructions tend to be more accurate than those of earlier methods. Let us now turn to our second application, shape design, which, unlike single view reconstruction, is directly applicable in an industrial context. In current practice, the typical way to optimize the aerodynamics of a vehicle, such as the car shown here, is to build a 3D mesh model and then to run a CAD simulator. If the results are not what was hoped for, which is often the case, the model is modified and the simulation rerun. This clearly works. Our cars move and our planes fly, but it is slow in large part because running each individual simulation takes a lot of time, and so does redesigning the models. One way to address this difficulty is to use what's known as a surrogate method. One runs a number of simulations on a training database of shapes, such as those shown here. On this slide, the colors represent pressure fields that can be used to estimate drag. The resulting pairs of shapes and associated drags can then be used to train a regressor to be used to predict the drag of previously unseen shapes at a much lower computational cost. This makes it possible to effectively explore the shape space and find the lowest drag shape. In our own work, we use a geodesic CNN for this purpose. As can be seen in this slide, the simulated result and the predicted ones are very close. Furthermore, predicted results are differentiable, which makes gradient-based optimization possible. To impose the right kind of priors on the shape space we want to explore, we couple our drag estimator D to the F theta function we introduced before. This yields a differentiable function that takes a code C as input and returns the drag D of C associated to the 3D shape S defined by C. To refine an initial car shape, we therefore use our encoder to generate an initial value of C. We then minimize D of C under the constraint that enough space must be left for the engine and passenger compartment. In this way, a pickup truck can automatically acquire a much more aerodynamic shape. And here is another example. We could, of course, have used a different parameterization of the initial shape to perform the drag minimization, and we tried. On comparative tests on the ShapeNet cars, ours performs on average noticeably better than its competitors. Occasionally, it even changes the topology of the initial shape, for example, by removing useless spoilers. In short, we have shown two important results. First, combining implicit and explicit surfaces at an early stage of a deep net architecture is beneficial. Second, deep sign function can be used to represent explicit surfaces while preserving end-to-end differentiability. As we have seen, this is readily applicable in the field of computer-aided design, and we hope that it will also open the doors to new applications in many other fields. Finally, I would like to thank all the people whose work I presented today and who are listed on this slide.
So thank you, Pascal. And so Pascal's available to answer any questions. As we did in the previous sessions, if you want to post questions to the chat, group chat, we can get Pascal to answer those. Or in the worst case, if I don't see it on the chat, you can unmute your microphone and ask the question. While we're waiting for those questions to come up, I do have a question. So the idea of sort of sampling points is, I guess, a clever way of not having to represent the entire surface. Right. But I'm just wondering if you want to have a very high resolution representation, then that sort of implies sampling lots and lots of points. So I'm wondering if that ends up getting you back to square one, where you end up, because you want high resolution, you need to sample a large number of points, and therefore you have to store a large representation anyway.
The size of the network that implements the SDF does not depend on how many points you are trying to sample. So that's the beauty of these all these folding nets and all the nets of that kind, is you have the million of parameters of the net, but that's always the same thing. Then you can sample as much as you want, and it doesn't make it bigger.
Okay, so you're trading off processing time then?
Yes, it's processing time, but that we have, right? We have all these big GPUs, and we can process a lot. We can even process in parallel if we want, since you can sample different parts of the surface at different times. But the problem with implicit surfaces, I mean, this all goes back to, I mean, for me, to Osher and Setien sometime, in the dark ages of computer vision, and it was really, really cool what they did with their level sets, but we could never use them for anything serious because we had to carry along the big cube of data, which would not fit in memory.
Right.
Whereas it seems that the deep nets have the expressive power to overcome that. And that's why, I mean, I had at the beginning of the talk, I had a list of publications from last year. It's certainly not exhaustive, and if I've forgotten anyone, I'm sorry, but there's been an incredible number of publications about this because of this very nice property.
So I should mention on that, if people want to revisit the talks, they'll all be available via YouTube afterwards and linked from the workshop website. So we do have two other questions. One from Dylan. So thanks for the great talk, Pascal. How efficient is running marching cubes in every forward pass? Okay,
not at all. But we don't have to do that, because in the real implementation, I didn't have time to go. I mean, I could have, I suppose, but I didn't go into the detail. In fact, you exploit the fact that not all the surface deforms a lot. So the parts that do not deform much, we do not rerun marching cube. We only rerun it when it's moved a lot, and that makes it, I wouldn't say efficient, but at least manageable. And there is another one.
There's another question, yeah, from Matthias Gadella. So for single view reconstruction applications, is there any benefit to sampling points on the surface and using that to get the silhouettes instead of performing volumetric rendering directly?
Okay, probably not. Why do we do single view reconstruction is because this is the accepted benchmark. If we want this paper to be published in any place, if we don't do this on benchmarks, the reviewers are going to throw us out. So we did. The real application, the one when there is a benefit, is the second one. It's the shape optimization one, because there you really, really need the meshes because all the CFD software runs on meshes. So either we rewrite, 30 years worth of CFD software, or we use meshes, and we chose the second alternative. Because maybe I should, have I answered because I'm digressing now, but have I answered the first part of the question? So, it's the single view reconstruction is a bit like ice skating competition. They are the imposed program. So that's the imposed program. The freestyle thing is the shape optimization, where we do what we really like. And there, our competition, so you'll find there is a trend in the literature to reformulate a lot of problems in terms of implicit representations. You have renderers and you have all sorts of things like that. And that's very interesting, but it's not entirely clear that you can reformulate everything in terms of implicit representations. And for those things where you can't, that's where our technique is useful. Okay, so person who asked the question is happy, so.
All right, do we have any other questions? I guess a follow-up to the question of you did the first part, the single view reconstruction, because you were forced to because people expect that. Yeah. So do you think now that this work's becoming acceptable or accepted that you can start doing the sort of more interesting stuff and not be forced to test on the benchmarks that people expect? Okay,
we are getting to my pet peeve is if you are trying to develop a new technique, the benchmarks are very useful, but they are a straitjacket. And so you have to spend a lot of time on them, as you said, not necessarily because I think it's the right thing to do. And actually, this is a discussion I've had with my students. I mean, the people who did the work and whose name is at the end of the talk, is they really, really want to do single view reconstruction. I keep telling them, yeah, but it's a made-up problem. Not single view reconstruction in general, but the way we do it. What do? We start with outlines. Where do we get the outlines from? That's a real vision problem. And quite reasonably, they tell me, maybe, but if we don't do that, we don't get published, and we don't get our PhDs, so we need to do it. And there's no answer to that. I mean, they're right.
Right.
I have a question, and I'll ask myself because I'm the next speaker. If there's time for a question.
We got a bit of time, so go ahead.
Yeah. So the thought was so texture makes this tricky, right? So
yes.
So in these implicit models, do you think you could get the same quality texture on surfaces versus mesh?
Right. So that's also one of the motivations for this. One of my colleagues is called Wenzel Jacob. I think he's well known by people who do graphics. And he has this beautiful differential renderer that operates on meshes. So this is one of the things we'd like to do is basically bring the two together and use this renderer to write the loss function and go to what I view as a much more realistic version of single view reconstruction, the one where we work with real images.
Mm.
And so, that's one of the motivations for this. One of my colleagues is called Wenzel Jacob. He's I think he's well known by people who do graphics. And he has this beautiful differential renderer that operates on meshes. So this is one of the things we'd like to do is basically bring the two together and use this renderer to write the loss function and go to what I view as a much more realistic version of single view reconstruction, the one where we work with real images. But of course, as you pointed out, this is very hard. There are so many variables to optimize that this is the vision problem. It's not quite solved yet. So.
All right, well, that might be a nice segue. So let's thank Pascal again.
Pleasure.
And Subhranshu is going to be talking more about, I guess, reconstruction and 3D models. So Subhranshu's been at University of Massachusetts Amherst and is a co-director of the Computer Vision Lab. He's been there since 2014. And is affiliated with the Center of Data Science at AWS AI. He spent 3 years as a research professor at TTI Chicago. And today he's going to be talking on inferring 3D shapes from image collections. So I'll hand over to you, Subhranshu.
Thanks. So let me share my slides. Okay. Can people see the slides and hear me all right?
It all looks good.
Perfect. All right. So today's talk, I'll talk about a few line work that we have done in our group on solving inverse problems. So an inverse problem is one when you have some measurements y of something, of some object x that's been shown in this arrow on top. But the measurement process is noisy and lossy. So the inverse problem is ill-posed. And the goal is to infer x and perhaps even the entire distribution p of x given y. Since it's ill-posed, one common way to solve these kinds of problems is to take a Bayesian approach. So here you put down a prior over the data x and try to minimize the reconstruction error. So one of the challenges in these kinds of problems is often P of x may be hard to learn because perhaps we don't have data. We don't have observations of x itself, so we cannot easily learn P of x. And of course, the optimization could be hard to solve, so all of this may be intractable. So in today's talk, I'll talk about 3 problems where we're going to reimagine this equation in different ways in order to solve these kinds of problems efficiently. And our goal is going to be reuse bits and pieces of automatic differentiation and graphics pipelines and differentiable renders and so on to model everything in sort of deep learning packages. So in all of these problems, we don't have access to x directly, so we can't train the inverse problem or the inverse model P of y given x using supervised learning, and instead we'll use sort of learning-free approaches. So in the first part of the talk, I'll talk about a problem where P of x is implicit, so we'd like to reconstruct some signal given multiple measurements. In the second part of the talk, we'll try to discover P of x. So given a large number of images, we'd like to discover what's the latent space of 3D objects that could have created these images. And in the third part, I'll talk about a problem where x is a program. So x transformation x to y is obtained using a rendering engine or a compiler that takes the program and generates a 3D shape or a 2D shape. Okay, so let's start with the first one. In the first part, we'll assume T is parameterized using something. So perhaps it's parameterized by viewpoint. And what you have are multiple observations or multiple measurements of the same instance X through different viewpoints. Okay, so this is, for example, you might have multiple views of this teapot from or different measurements in tomography coming from different angles of your X-rays and so on. So one interesting observation made 2 years ago was this idea that you can replace this energy minimization problem with an unconstrained optimization problem as follows. So instead of minimizing x directly, you reparameterize x using a generator. So x is some parameterized function, f theta of some input noise. And instead of optimizing x, you optimize the parameters of this neural network. And it turns out that because of the way these deep networks work, even random parameters generate smooth functions. And in fact, if you replace this p of x by the space of outputs that a neural network can generate, you induce a reasonable prior over natural images. So that was the idea in this deep image prior paper by Ulyanov et al. And you can think of why this works by thinking of this a random neural network as a Gaussian process, and similar observations have been made by other people as well. But the main advantage is that now you can replace p of x using a parameterized neural network family, and the optimization can becomes easy to solve. But that can only be done if the function t is also differentiable, because we would like to backpropagate through the error function. So it turns out that there are lots of scenarios, especially for shape reconstruction, where t indeed is differentiable. So let's look at tomography, for example. So given an image, the way tomography is computed is mathematically what you compute is the radon transformation. So these are essentially line integrals of the function, which is shown as this function r, which is parameterized by the slope and intercept of the line. So the transformation, forward transformation, can be easily implemented using upsampling and integration in let's say, PyTorch, and this becomes a differentiable module that you can backpropagate through. So you can so replace that energy minimization problem by composing this deep image prior with this differentiable projection function, and solve this using gradient descent. Okay. All right, so let's see how this works. As a comparison, these are three images, and these sinograms or these radon projections were computed with sparse set of angles, and there was also a little bit of noise. So once you do a very naive inversion, this is filtered back projection, which has a very sort of poor prior over the X, you get the reconstructions that look like this. So you, on the top are two numbers, PSNR and SSIM, both need to be higher for good reconstruction. So with the better prior, this is TV prior, the reconstructions look better. This is iterative BM3D. This is one of the top performing methods for denoising. The reconstructions look quite a bit better, but combining this deep image prior together with the differentiable radon projections, you get quite a bit better results. Okay. So again, these methods are trained without any label data, so you didn't have access to what clean samples look like, and they're optimized from scratch on each example. So the same idea works exactly the same way, roughly, for reconstructing 3D shape from a bunch of silhouette images. Okay, so this is the classic problem of visual hull reconstruction, and a baseline algorithm is to simply intersect the volumes. Okay, but that process of a volume to silhouette is again very similar to these line integrals, and you can combine that with these noisy observations to reconstruct the 3D volume itself. So here, instead of generating an image, we're generating a implicit function in a volumetric representation, similar to what Pascal was describing earlier, where we're representing the shape itself using a neural network. Okay, so here are some examples. So compared to space carving, our results tend to look smoother, and also works for sort of more complex shapes. But one of the main advantages is our method is quite a bit more robust to viewpoint noise. So if you have errors in viewpoint estimation in these visual hull algorithms, you tend to lose all the details in thin structures. So for example, the table legs are gone because the viewpoints cancel each other out. But because our rendering process is differentiable both with respect to the shape and the viewpoint parameters, we can optimize all of this jointly to do the reconstruction. Okay. So similarly, you can write down a render that computes the depth of an image instead of a binary silhouette. These are equations which are simply computing visibility of each pixel and then adding up the visibility to compute the depth. Okay. So now you can reconstruct a 3D shape given noisy depth images, and these are what the constructions look like. And even with quite a bit of noise and sparse set of inputs, you can get reasonable reconstructions of 3D shapes. Okay. So now let's look at a harder setting. So imagine you have a collection of images. So you open up a catalog of furniture and you find all these chairs, and each chair is perhaps taken from a different viewpoint, and they're all different. And in your head, you would like to imagine what is the space of shapes of chairs that could have generated these images. Okay. So if you did not have viewpoint annotations and there weren't the same instance, it rules out some algorithms that you can imagine. So visual hull in the previous slide wouldn't work, structure from motion wouldn't work, and this becomes much more challenging. Okay. So the motivation here is like, you can go to the internet and find pictures of things you're interested about, so puffins, and you would like to understand what is the 3D shape distribution of puffins. And you can see these puffins are all different, they're articulated, they're taken from different viewpoints. And ideally would like to do this without having to label lots of things in each image. Okay. So this problem is also what's called non-rigid structure from motion. And the reason this is hard is often you may not have a sense of what the shape distribution looks like. So much of non-rigid structure from motion has been applied for objects where you have a compact 3D shape representations of perhaps faces and human bodies, but if the object is unstructured like a chair or is heavily articulated, then discovering the 3D shape itself is, or representing it is challenging. So we use the power of deep networks to represent the latent space of 3D to model the P of X itself. Okay, the problem setting is you're given a set of images. So again, we'll simplify this problem. Again, it's a toy problem where we assume we have a bunch of silhouettes. So you are given a bunch of projections of airplanes here. And your goal is to discover a 3D shape distribution of airplane shapes. The way we're going to do this is we'll generate a factorized method to generate images. First, we will generate 3D shapes and then project them onto binary silhouettes using a differentiable render. Okay, so here G theta Z is a sampled shape from the generative model, and PR of that is its projection. So the idea is if I sample enough of these, I get a distribution. I would like this distribution to look like the distribution of images or views that have been given. Okay, and the hope is that if I see enough of these views, the only way I can learn a good underlying representation is to get something that looks like the real distribution of 3D shapes. Okay, so the entire thing in picture, so we have this latent space Z, from which we'll first, given a Z, generate a 3D shape. Then we will use a bit of the Z to generate a viewpoint, and then render the 3D shape from that viewpoint. Okay, so we have a factorized generative model. So it generates images, so we can combine it with a discriminator that operates on images itself and backpropagate the loss all the way to train the generator. Okay, so that's, we call it PR GAN because it's a GAN with a projection module. So here's some examples of what it learned. So the input these binary silhouettes, and on the right, on the top are the 3D models that it generates. So there's sort of, you can see the shapes have some 3D structure. What's nice is the model learns to generate these 3D shapes in a canonical pose and renders them from different viewpoints. So you get some implicit viewpoint and part correspondences across objects. So there was an earlier talk today about learning symmetries, and there was a question that came up which was on how do we impose symmetries in 3D, and one thought is perhaps these graphics engines and differentiable renders can let you combine aspects of view-based learning and symmetries that are explicit in the 3D data. On the right is a generative model obtained by projecting these 3D shapes onto binary images. And it turns out it's actually quite hard to learn a 2D GAN on images, and instead the 3D GAN plus projection module is a better 2D GAN. All right, so here's vases, which are symmetric, but the model doesn't know that. But once you train it from lots of data, it learns to imagine these kinds of shapes from different viewpoints. Okay. So the model doesn't have a notion of categories, so you can mix viewpoint objects from different categories together and throw them into the same generative model. And these are the 3D shapes it learns to generate. Okay, so now the airplanes are inverted because that's the best way to share parameters for generating motorcycles and cars and so on. Okay, so the quality of the shapes aren't that great, but this is one of the limitations of GANs in particular, but also that our supervision is very limited. So in some recent work, we have tried to improve it. So the kinds of things that are easy to label on images are things like depth or part segmentation. So suppose you had a set of projections where you could color the silhouette with different parts. So here we have the fuselage of the plane in pink, the wings in yellow. And if you're given a collection of these, you can imagine a volumetric representation where the voxels are also colored, and then project them to produce a colored image. Okay, so that's what's being illustrated here. But with these kinds of labels, it's much easier for the model to discover details. So now you can see that these planes have some structure like engines and the stabilizers and so on. So it's a comparison of the 3D discovered 3D representations from silhouettes at the very bottom with parts in the middle, and even using depth at the top. And what we found is sort of these part correspondence are just as powerful as explicit depth representations. So you're getting something like structure from motion, but being able to share the latent space across the shape categories. All right, so in summary, these kinds of projective methods can be combined with generative models, either GANs or implicit ones, to discover 3D structure. But the quality can be improved if you knew something about the viewpoints or have part annotations or have pose estimates. So these methods can be combined to improve results. Okay, all right. Then very quickly at the last part of our work, we want to infer a program that generates a shape. So the main motivation for an approach like this is we want a representation that's interpretable, perhaps editable, so that you can easily change it or apply it. So in particular, we're going to look at constructive solid geometry, where these programs represent instructions such as create an object, intersect with another object, and apply these kinds of Boolean operations in order to generate shapes. So this kind of programs are popular for manufacturing parts and so on. Okay, so here's an example. So here's a constructed 2D geometry. So given a shape, you would like to write down a program like this, which is represented by the sparse tree here. And a compiler can take this program and perform these instructions and output a final rendered output. Okay, so the process in our image, X goes to Y. The T here is now a CSG engine, a compiler. Okay, and the space of programs can be described by these set of rules or grammar. So here, each shape is either a primitive or a Boolean operation applied to two shapes. Okay, so that can generate lots of different kinds of shapes. You can do this in 3D, where the primitives are now 3D primitives. And here on the right is an example that has many such primitives compiled together. Okay, so one of the challenges in these kinds of problems is how do we train these models that take inputs and produce outputs without having access to lots and lots of labels. So if you had labels, you could train CNN combined with a recurrent model to produce these programs as a set of steps. Okay, you need something that can deal with variable length programs and so on. So RNNs are a good choice. But if you did not have labels, you could run the program and produce an output and minimize some sort of a reconstruction error. So it turns out there is an additional challenge. So even if your renderer was differentiable, so you can implement CSG in PyTorch and make all of this end-to-end differentiable, but because the space of programs is discrete, you still need some sampling-based method to train these kinds of RNN parameters. So you use something like policy gradients, reinforced-like algorithms to do this. Okay. So again, in pictures, we have a CNN that encodes the image and a recurrent model that spits out a program instruction in each time step till you reach a stop symbol. You have a CSG engine that compiles the program, produces the shape, and then you train it using reinforce. Okay. All right. So it turns out it's actually relatively hard to train these kinds of models. So the model initially does not produce any grammatical programs, so the compiler fails to run it. So instead, we found it useful to pre-train this model in lots and lots of synthetic data where we have supervised labels. So the CNN RNN learns to encode the space of grammar. And then we would like to train these models on real images. So we use policy gradients to fine-tune the network parameters on real domains. So maybe logos or CAD shapes. So just as some sanity check experiments, so we can generate lots and lots of synthetic examples. You might wonder if this model is doing anything better than, let's say, nearest neighbor. And here's a comparison of nearest neighbor examples retrieved for a given shape and what the CNN RNN generates using beam search. Okay, so that we're looking at top 10 examples. So it turns out the diversity and the combinatorial nature of the space, there are lots of shapes which just nearest neighbor examples aren't close enough. So the method doesn't do very well in terms of chamfer distance, whereas the CSGNet can often find good reconstructions, and often the nearest examples look semantically closer. If I don't have an explicit quantitative way of saying it, but visually they do look much more reasonable. So here are some examples on these logo images, which what you're seeing are inputs, and on the output are the reconstructions made by the algorithm, and the program is shown in the bottom, where you have these different primitives and they're combined using different binary operations, not shown. to reconstruct the image. And it also turns out that the CSGNet is a better primitive detector than an object detection algorithm like FastRCNN by a little bit. And it turns out this is mainly to do with how these models reason about occlusions and overlaps. So in object detection, there is a difficult step, which is non-max suppression, which can often delete overlapping objects and so on. And because CSGNet reasons about these kinds of things explicitly, it tends to do a lot better in terms of detection, and it's also a little bit faster. All right. So with that, let me sum up. So I talked about 3 different papers which were in the space of solving inverse problems without necessarily having tons of supervision to train the inverse model directly. And we combine ideas from implicit shape representations and differentiable graphics engines or rendering processes to train these kinds of models. And I'd like to thank Matthias and Gopal, who are the students leading much of the work. And thank you for having me here. All right.
Great. Thank you, Subhranshu, for an excellent talk. Once again, we'll take questions through the chat session or unmute your microphone. I've got a question to start things off, which is that I guess one of the issues with inverse problems is that they tend to be ill-posed, right? You know, there's no sort of unique solution, and I was sort of looking through some of those logo examples here. Yeah, so this slide here, where I think it was slide 33, you're showing some logos and the programs that generated them, and in particular there's no unique program, right? There are many programs that would generate these logos. So how do you deal with that, and how do you maybe search for the shortest program that would generate
yeah, so some of it is through training. So I didn't get a time to go into how do we shape rewards for training these algorithms. So these methods have the natural tendency to generate short programs. In fact, it's partly that these recurrent networks can't model long-term dependencies and so on. So, and some of it is also through what I call the reward shaping. So you can trade off how much you're penalizing or how much you penalize length versus reconstruction error at training time. So you get these models which have this specific cost versus the reconstruction quality trade-off that in some ways is annoying because you can't at test time sort of say, let me get a little bit more and can I get a better reconstruction? So these models commit to a specific trade-off, which is in optimization, you would have that knob at test time, which we don't. We thought about that in a little bit. But coming back to sort of how do we deal with uncertainty? So in some sense, these gradient methods, you can do a little bit of extra work by adding gradient noise and get some uncertainty estimates during inference. So especially with the deep image prior, that sort of work, and get some sampling-based estimates. But again, it's fairly limited, I would say. You don't quite get the multiple modes and so on.
Right. And I mean, symmetries and optimization tend to be very difficult to deal with anyway, right? I mean, you want to have some sort of ordering imposed. Yeah. Okay, so we have a question from Anoop. So, first of all, he says, wonderful talk. It was a wonderful talk. And for the projection GAN, do you approximately register the silhouette image?
Yes, we do. I mean, in fact, it's our pose variable is just a viewpoint on a sphere. So implicitly, there's an assumption that the object silhouettes are centered. So you can imagine being the viewpoint variable being larger to have more general distributions of things, but then in practice that optimization, you're sort of relying on this hope that the only way to generate these silhouettes would be through really learning the 3D distribution. So that sort of breaks down if you don't see enough viewpoints of the objects. So in one of the experiments, we had this issue where we only were generating 4 views of a chair, and the model would learn to generate these Franken chairs that looked right from all these 4 views, but all the parts were sort of hanging in the air. So once we had more views, that solution was not possible anymore. So there's some assumption there.
Thanks.
So I actually noticed when you had the results for the mixed objects, right? The reconstructions tended to be just prisms, the silhouette sort of extruded back.
Right.
Whereas when it was the same object, you actually were able to recover the shape, I guess.
Yeah, right. So yeah, so there's some of the mode collapse issues, so it's super finicky to train these GANs, and this is sort of result from 2017. So it's the GAN technology has moved up quite a bit. So I think it's so in the journal version of the paper, which has some of these, you see a bit more structure, but there's also this trade-off the model has to make on getting the details of one model, one category more versus dealing with the entire distribution. So that's also.
But you think that the mixed shapes were, or categories was a mode collapse?
Yeah.
In the GAN. Okay.
Likely. Yeah.
All right. Do we have any other questions? Well, if not, let's thank Subhranshu again.
Thank you.
All right, so we're up to the last talk of the invited talk of the workshop. It'll be given by Zico Coulter. So Zico is an associate professor in the computer science department with the School of Computer Science at Carnegie Mellon University. In addition to that, he serves as chief scientist of the AI research for the Bosch Center for AI, working out of Pittsburgh. And his group focuses on machine learning, optimization, and control. Specifically, a lot of the work is focused on making deep learning algorithms safer, more robust, and more explainable. So today, Zico is going to talk about deep equilibrium models and monotone operators, and I will hand over to Zico.
Great, Steve. Thanks so much. Let me try sharing my screen here, see if this all works. All right, share screen. This one. And moment of truth. Can everyone see the slides?
Yes, that's all.
Okay, and you can see them also. You can see them not with like the presentation view. You see them just normally, right?
We see the full slide. Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right. Well, it's wonderful to be here. I'm going to talk today about some of our work in deep equilibrium models, and this is really actually going to be based upon. So this is joint work with several two of my students, Xiaoxi Bai and Ezra Winston, as well as a lot of collaboration with Ladlin Colton at Intel. This talk is really going to be based on 3 papers. 2 of the papers on deep equilibrium models. Oops, let me get the cursor back. 2 papers based upon deep equilibrium models, the one that appeared last year at NeurIPS, and one on multi-scale deep equilibrium models, which is about to be put on archive. Unfortunately, there's going to be 2 papers in this talk that are still going up on archive this week, but you can use it, I guess, as an ad for checking those papers out when they're released. The other paper this relates to is work on monotone operators and deep equilibrium models, which is also going to be out this week on archive. And I'm happy to, I'll provide some link to the end where this will be up this week. So this talk is first going to sort of talk about all 3 of these papers, actually. First, we're going to talk a little bit about deep equilibrium models as a whole, then about multi-scale decks, and then about these monotone operator decks. But to give a broad overview, what I'm talking about today kind of relates to the story we all tell about deep learning. So what we say about deep learning, at least what I say about deep learning often when I'm teaching it for the first time, is that deep networks in some sense kind of process inputs in a hierarchical fashion, right? So there's this classical example of, you have a deep network that in the first layer you extract edges, and the next layer you extract things like eyes and stuff like that, and then parts of faces, and you find full faces in the last layer. And what this talk is about is that to a certain extent, I think this view is actually kind of incorrect. I think there's obviously some things that they're true about it, but it doesn't really capture the full story about what depth is really doing in deep networks. And I think we can gain a lot by rethinking depth. And so what this talk is about, it's going to be about how we replace deep networks with a single implicit layer network. And this is not, the old theory about, a single layer is good, it's exponentially sized. Now I'm talking about the same number of parameters. And things work just as well. And this is both in theory and in practice. This is a model called the deep equilibrium model. It does have some drawbacks, though, as it was first proposed last year at NeurIPS. And so I'm also going to talk in this talk about two follow-on pieces of work we've done to scale these to large-scale vision, modern computer vision tasks, and to sort of understand the theory of these things a lot better. And I'm going to touch on all three of these points. Okay, so to start off with, I want to talk about deep equilibrium models. As I mentioned, this is based upon our paper last year at NeurIPS. So to start off with, I'm going to start as our starting point as a traditional deep network, which looks something like this, right? Of course, they can be much more complex. They can have residual layers, things like that, but just take this as a starting point. We have these the hidden units of our network, which I'm calling the Z here, are typically given as some function of the previous layer. And so typically this is something like a linear operator W applied to these hidden units plus a bias term, and then you apply a nonlinearity like a ReLU or something like this. Of course, that linear operator doesn't have to just be a matrix multiply. It can be a convolution, many other things. But this basic form is kind of the building block for modern deep networks. And what I'm going to move towards is actually, sort of the first step of what we're going to get towards is we're going to consider a little bit of a modification of this network here. And we're going to modify it in two ways. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to add weight tying to this network. So I'm going to take this network that we have here, and I'm going to apply the same weight matrix W to all the layers. And that might seem like a big restriction. That's actually not. It's actually, I'll mention some theory in a second, but it turns out you can actually prove that any network you can construct with a normal kind of feed-forward network, you can construct with these weight-tied networks. And more importantly, it actually works almost as well in practice. So a lot of modern networks actually are moving towards weight-tied structure because it isn't actually that big of a deal to do this. You just have a little bit bigger hidden unit, you weight-tie networks, weight-tie all the layers, and things work fine. So that's the first thing. We weight-tie the layers together. The second thing is that we add this input injection. So to every layer, we add some input, U, some matrix or convolution or operator, times the input X, and add that to the thing. Again, that's not too big a restriction. That's just saying that we keep around a little bit of the input and we add it to every layer. So the basic idea here is that these networks, despite what seems to be kind of their seeming limitations here, are actually very powerful. So they really aren't a limitation in practice. They really have, this is actually, if you squint at this, this is, of course, very related to a recurrent network. And things like this go back to the roots of things like recurrent backpropagation, which has been built a lot upon in previous years. It also relates very heavily, I should add, to neural ODEs. This sort of structure of repeatedly applying an operator and a nonlinearity is very, very similar to what neural ODEs sort of look like in practice. And there's also a lot of modern sort of practical networks that recovered this structure anyway. So things like trellis networks, which was an architecture that we worked on previously, or universal transformers. They've all actually sort of come to the same conclusion that you don't really need to have different weights or different layers. Things kind of works fine. So now we're at kind of an interesting point here, because now we're defining a network as the repeated application of this same function again and again, right? So we can think of a deep network as just the repeated application of some function. So zi plus 1 equals nonlinearity times wzi plus ux plus v. So this is our function here. But this is now sort of just the repeated iteration of a nonlinear function. And when you do this in practice, at least with networks that actually work in practice, what you will find is that if you repeat this iteration, then the networks will actually converge. The hidden units will converge to a fixed point or an equilibrium point. And that kind of corresponds to an infinite depth network. It basically corresponds to a point which I'm going to call Z star here, where when I apply this function again, things don't change, right? Things actually stay the same. And then, as I said, this sort of corresponds to the infinite depth limit of this network. And while there's definitely no guarantee this is going to happen for sure, the network could, of course, be unstable, or it could diverge, or it could oscillate. For a lot of networks in practice, this does happen. And if this does happen, this says, I think, something very fundamental about the nature of what these networks are doing. What these networks are doing, what depth is doing in these networks in some sense, is that it's computing the equilibrium point, the fixed point of some nonlinear dynamical system. And the idea of this deep equilibrium model, or DEC model, that, as we presented it last year at NeurIPS, is that we just want to directly find this equilibrium point via root finding. So if we're looking for this equilibrium point anyway, if this is the product of deep networks, let's just go ahead and find this anyway, rather than iterating the forward model. And of course, I'm showing it in a very simple case here, where it's just literally a single layer. In practice, at least for the first part of this, I'll actually think about a little bit more complex things. So this simple function is like a single residual block or a slightly more complex cell. But it's just a repeated application of these nonlinear blocks. Now, of course, the question is, when you have a network like this, how do you train these networks? So this is non-trivial, but actually, fortunately, this is sort of the one workshop where I don't have to get into too much detail about how you train them. I think a lot of this has been covered already. And so what you do is that in the forward pass, you just compute the equilibrium point. So essentially, you use any method, like Broyden's method, to solve for this equilibrium point Z star. I guess I should have mentioned Broyden's is sort of a generic nonlinear root finding technique that is actually very similar to methods like LBFGS for optimization. So you find this equilibrium point, and I'm actually going to abbreviate this function here, the sigma, WX, etc., just as F of X star and F of X star and X, of Z star and X. So you have your equilibrium point, then you would do something like, often your actual output is not the same size as your hidden layer, so you maybe have one more linear layer, compute a loss to this, and that's the entirety of the forward pass. Now, I'll get to it in a second. The next step, of course, is how do you train these things? And the backward pass here is a little bit trickier, but fortunately, we actually know how to do this by all the sort of the work we've been doing in this field of implicit models and declarative networks recently. It turns out that even though these networks involve a fixed point computation in their forward pass, you can actually differentiate through it analytically using the implicit function theorem. This is the actual form it is. The precise form itself isn't too important. You have this weird sort of I minus a Jacobian inverse term. You wouldn't actually compute that Jacobian and invert it. That would be too big. What you instead do is you solve for these inverses using some indirect method, like conjugate gradient or something like that. We actually use Broyden's method for that as well. Now, one point I want to make that I do want to highlight here, though, is that everything we're talking about here is using this analytical form of backprop. So I am not saying we should unroll our forward computation to do this. That would require that we keep around all the intermediate iterates. And one of the big benefits of these implicit models is that we only need to keep in memory this one equilibrium point. We actually don't need to keep around the intermediate computation like we would if we actually unrolled the computation. So it's important that I'm advocating here for analytical computation of the equilibrium point and analytical backprop through it. Now, also, these things have some nice theoretical results. So it turns out that as I mentioned, a single layer DEC is actually sufficient to represent any feed-forward deep network, including deep networks with residual connections and stuff like that. It's a simple proof. It's not actually what you do, and basically you just stack all the layers of the network together and keep applying a function like this. It's important to know this is actually just for the theory. It's not what's done in practice. So in practice, you just pick a little bit larger hidden unit and you solve these things, and that works just as well as other networks in practice. as we'll see in a second. And the second theorem, that sort of theory we have about this, is that a single layer deck is sufficient also for representing anything like a multi-layer deck. So there's, despite the cool sounding name, it would not actually be useful to stack multiple decks together. So a stacked deck is not very useful because you actually can always compress multiple equilibrium solves into a single equilibrium solve. Now, this does leave open some interesting points though, like that you sort of might naturally think about this. So, what about like uniqueness of the fixed point? What about stability of these solves? Everything's very unclear now, and actually a large part of this that I'll get to in this talk is sort of trying to address those things. So how well does this actually work? Well, it turns out that on a lot of tasks, this works sort of incredibly well, these sorts of models. So we use this to, we applied this to a sequence modeling task on the Wikitext 103 data set. And this is typically measured by perplexity, how good a language model is. And compared to sort of state-of-the-art language models, like a Transformer XL language model, at the same number of parameters, these DEC models with basically the equivalent number of parameters with a similar sort of functional cell end up outperforming the explicit depth model. So for example, with 5 million parameters, we get a lower perplexity and a lot lower memory consumption because we, again, are not having to store around intermediate layers together. Similarly, for a network like a trellis net, we can improve upon perplexity and vastly here upon memory consumption. And this sort of pattern continues. Now, I should mention that we're still not quite up to the largest size training yet, just because we don't have the biggest transformers are trained on things like TPUs. We haven't done that yet. But these trends seem to continue. For matching parameter count, you get better performance. There are some drawbacks though. So first of all, DECs right now are slower than traditional networks because finding that fixed point tends to be slower than a typical deep model with an equivalent number of parameters. And we also need to get actually pretty reasonable conversion to the equilibrium point. You can't just run like 5 iterations of Broyden, so you have to get a little bit more accurate for the implicit function theorem to really apply. Then maybe more fundamentally, single layer DECs as we present them here is sort of great theoretically, but they lose a lot of the multi-scale nature that we do believe is sort of inherent to computer vision and tasks like this, right? We do believe that processing an image happen at multiple scales, and we don't want to give that all up just for a single kind of fixed size layer, period. The other thing is that, as I mentioned before, questions like the existence or uniqueness of the fixed points is largely heuristic, and it requires a lot of tweaking to get right in practice. So actually, there was some reasonable recent papers that sort of said that they tried DECs and basically said that, oh, it didn't work in our setting because it wouldn't converge or things like that. So in the next 2 parts, I wanted to sort of very briefly highlight some of the current work we're doing to address these deficiencies. The first work I want to talk about is this notion of multi-scale DECs, which I highlighted earlier, and as I mentioned before, is going to be posted to archive this week. So the challenge of applying DECs to vision domains, there's actually a lot of challenges, right? Images are inherently hierarchical in some sense. We really do want a way of analyzing them at different spatial scales. And they're also large, and so which presents a few problems for DEC models, right? So if you think about like full HD video images, if you apply a convolution to these things as your linear operator, you would need to apply a whole lot of convolution before that kind of effect mixed over the whole image. And it turns out, even though our methods are more efficient, you still can't even store all the intermediate Jacobians and things like this for Broyden's method with images and inputs this big. And so to do this, to sort of handle these situations, we developed a slightly different DEC model, which we call the multi-scale deep equilibrium model. And the key idea here is that we're going to do the same thing, but as a normal DEC, but our hidden unit here, the Z, the Z star, the equilibrium point, is actually going to represent multiple different spatial scales simultaneously, and we're going to solve for the equilibrium point for all of them at the same time. So I'm going to sort of build up what this looks like. So we have our image, say a panda image here. We're going to represent a hidden unit that captures the image at multiple scales at the same time. So we have, a high resolution scale Z1 and a very low resolution scale Zn, typically with more channels though, like in normal deep networks. And what our function is going to do, what our F function, right, the sort of the single unit we're going to apply here, what it will do is it will apply a residual block to all of these scales simultaneously. It'll also add input injection to the highest resolution scale. Then, importantly, it will mix all of these together. Okay, so it'll, by downsampling or upsampling, it'll mix all the spatial scales together. And this whole block now is actually what we call our function. That is our function that we apply to the image. And then we use a multi-scale equilibrium solver to find simultaneously a set of equilibrium points that is satisfied over all these scales at the same time. Sort of is a fixed point of this F, this multi-scale F. And then we can send these things, high resolution versions or low resolution versions to a loss function. One of the very nice things about this architecture is that you can think of these multiple different resolutions as kind of different heads for different tasks. So there are, high resolution losses like segmentation losses or low resolution losses like classification losses. You can actually apply all of these to the same model. And what we'll actually show in a few slides is that you can apply the same MDEC model, multi-scale DEC model, to both classification or segmentation tasks and perform very competitively with the current state of the art. We also had to fix things a little bit to make them more memory efficient. So we implemented a limited memory Broyden solver, similar to like an LBFGS type method, to further reduce memory requirements of finding the fixed point. But this is basically all that we had to do to make this thing work. Now, how does it work? Well, I'll actually go through the results very quickly here because it works well, but that's not sort of the point I want to highlight. So something for domains like CVPR 10, these are actually been the sort of the largest domains that previous implicit models like neural ODEs or other similar models really apply to. Or this is sort of amongst the largest scale that they apply to, of course, for vision tasks. And here, if you compare sort of how a pure neural ODE or a pure augmented neural ODE does against our model, what you find is that our models sort of for when you fix number of parameters, again, the MDEC here, which is the last column on the right here, sort of vastly outperforms these other implicit models here, even outperforms like a ResNet of a similar size. This is actually also with no data augmentation to replicate some of the results that were used for these papers. And there's also a big advantage of using this sort of multi-scale treatment. So if you use a single DEC, like a single convolution, you just sort of keep it at the same size the whole time. We call this a single stream DEC, and it performs much worse on these domains. Similarly, if you of course, these are not groundbreaking results for CVPR by any means. This is very small scale models. If you increase parameter size, of course, our methods scale up, and you can get things that are on par with sort of good methods for CVPR, though even this is sort of a quick experiment here and not really our focus. If you look at the story for ImageNet, the story kind of is similar here. We're going to compare sort of small scale models and larger scale models. And the point I want to make is actually that I'm just taking a bunch of kind of traditional models for ImageNet, and what we find is that with small models, we're definitely not the best model per parameter count, but we're sort of right up there with the state of the art into the top one accuracy, beating things like ResNet 50, beating things like ResNet 18 certainly with similar scales of parameter counts. And then if you increase size even further with like ResNet 101s or DenseNet models, you similarly get very good top one performance. And again, this is far, far beyond what, as far as we know, anything is sort of being done with implicit layer models for these sorts of large scale image tasks. The last thing I want to highlight is similar results on segmentation. So we're talking about here the cityscapes image segmentation, visual semantic segmentation task here. And again, maybe go into this briefly because I don't want to have it spend too much time, dwell on it too much time. For small models, MDEC here, which is on the right, gets very competitive MOU, and as you scale things up, it actually beats models like DeepLab v3 or PSPNet. Again, not quite the current state of the art, but almost second to the current state of the art in terms of this performance. What's very impressive, though, and that point I actually want to highlight here. Here are some. Here, of course, we're required by law to include some screenshots of the actual segmentations it produces. They look pretty good. I guess that's all you should get out of that figure there. The point I want to highlight, though, that I think is really cool here, is that it's the exact same model that we apply to ImageNet as we apply to semantic segmentation. The only difference is that on the ImageNet, you apply classification loss to the highest resolution, And on cityscapes, you apply a segmentation loss on the highest resolution. And this is the only difference. Other than that, these models are identical. You actually pre-train the model with ImageNet before you apply cityscapes. That's very standard. But there's no backbone. There's nothing like this when it relates to sort of traditional segmentation. And it really does show that these things are you know, they are not just problems. They're not just for toy problems. They really do scale and are competitive with state-of-the-art on large-scale vision tasks. So finally, though, I want to highlight some additional recent work we're doing, which again will be on arXiv this week, on sort of understanding better the theory of these networks. Because the reality is, so far, there's very little we can say about this fixed point. Even for a single iteration like this, where this is a single layer, it can be very difficult. This still is a nonlinear dynamical system. And in general, it can be very difficult to establish existence, uniqueness, stability of these fixed point iterations. And so, you know, unlike neural ODEs, where things like Picard's theorem actually can guarantee existence and uniqueness, DEX do not have, or traditional DEX do not have this property. The other thing is that, you know, I'm talking about sort of one layer being all you need, but the one layer of an MDAC was really pretty complex, right? It was sort of included residual blocks and upsampling, downsampling, et cetera. So we really do want to think about analyzing a simpler formulation that is still representationally powerful. And to do this, the tool we're going to bring to bear here is a monotone operator theory. So this is a beautiful theory that sort of actually relates to how how a lot of convex optimization methods are solved. So things like proximal gradient methods or ADMM. A lot of these things are based upon monotone operators. And there has been a little bit of work actually by some of the authors of monotone operators looking at connections between these things in deep learning, though not going sort of in the same direction that we're going. And so here's the key result that I want to sort of which I'm not going to prove at all because it actually is a little bit, but think of it kind of like an ad for the upcoming paper. The key result we have is that if you consider a single layer deck, like this. So Z star equals some nonlinearity applied to a linear operator applied to Z star plus, you know, a linear operator applied to the input plus a bias term. Then there exists a unique, so there is guaranteed to exist a unique fixed point of the system, provided that the weight matrix obeys some positive definiteness condition. And basically, the 2 times identity has to be greater than in the positive definite sense of W plus W transpose. That's condition number 1. Condition number 2 is that nonlinearity itself, so this nonlinearity here is given by a prox operator, a proximal operator for some convex function. Proximal operators are, you know, minimize the square difference of a function or of a point with some input plus a convex function. I won't get into what that is. Again, if you're unfamiliar with those, the paper will describe all these things. And this result actually comes from the fact that a fixed point can be viewed as a solution to what's called a monotone operator splitting problem. So there's actually a very deep connection between the fixed point that DEX are trying to compute and monotone operator splitting. And it's really sort of a beautiful theory, and it's sort of laid out much more in the paper we have coming out. Now, one thing that's important to note is that we actually are not requiring that W kind of be stable in the normal sense. It can still actually have very large operator norm. It just needs to be large kind of in the negative or imaginary components. So actually can have operator norm, which makes even the fixed point iteration, so you just repeat this thing, actually can be unstable. But by monotone operator theory, you actually can still prove that it will have a unique fixed point, even if the iteration is unstable. And of course, also monotone operator methods give you ways of finding that fixed point that are more efficient. So this is sort of, you know, these are these 2 conditions we have to connect monotone operators and DEC models. And the question is, are these reasonable assumptions, right? So can we reasonably assume that the nonlinearity is a prox operator and that we have this positive definiteness condition? And for the prox operator, yes, a lot of sort of natural nonlinears we use anyway, like the ReLU, are already prox operators, and a lot of them that aren't quite can be represented arbitrarily well with prox operators. Now, secondly, though, is it reasonable to assume that we have this sort of condition on the weights, that we have this weight condition that the W matrix satisfies a certain linear matrix inequality? And there's the answer sort of is no. This actually does happen to be true at initialization for a lot of initializations of these sort of common initializations, I should say. But during training, this will be violated almost certainly if you train a network normally. And so the trick that we use here to actually make this all work is that we have to reparameterize the network, or parameterize the network in a way that enforces this condition. So if in particular, if you define W in this manner here for other operators, other linear operators f and g, and this sort of involves a negative definite component and kind of an anti-symmetric component here, then you actually can guarantee this will be the case. M here is just actually a small constant, a small positive constant. And so this is really the key here, is that we're defining a network such that monotonicity, which is what this condition actually enforces, is always satisfied by the network. Now, the advantages of this parameterization and this formalism is that, as I already mentioned, we have a unique fixed point. And we can also use operator splitting approaches, not just sort of to guarantee there is a solution, but we can also use them to find these solutions much more efficiently than we would otherwise. So methods like Peaceman-Rackford iteration, which was actually very related to also Douglas-Rackford iteration, which you may have heard of if you've looked at things like ADMM and all. These are methods that converge much more rapidly than just the typical sort of iteration of our function we would normally think about applying to find a root. And this is actually a very powerful theory that gives us guaranteed ways to get linear convergence of our equilibrium point. The other very cool thing is that the backwards pass can also be computed via the implicit function theorem and also has an operator splitting formulation, which lets us actually reuse these same efficient methods, not just for the forward pass, but also for the backward pass. So how does this work? So in some initial studies here, this is not going to be the same scale as the MDEC models, but it's actually sort of a similar kind of idea here. We actually can use a simple multi-scale network where we sort of have just the downsampling components of the network, not the upsampling ones of the full MDEC. But here, basically, the matrices are either just square convolutions or they are downsampled convolutions. There are tricks you need to do here to enforce the positive definiteness of this matrix, and you have to be able to compute actually its inverse via an FFT to use the really fast operator splitting methods. But we do both of these things, and we do actually get results that are still quite competitive. So with a modest number of parameters, we're able to substantially still outperform the other methods that have guaranteed solutions. So this is now in the domain of these methods that sort of we know are always guaranteed to converge, that have a well-defined fixed point, and we're still getting most of the benefit from these DEC models. Okay, so sort of to conclude this sort of whirlwind tour here of these three papers. The idea of deep equilibrium models is that one layer kind of in some sense is all you need. You don't need to have explicit, very deep networks. You actually can just use a single layer network as long as you allow for like an implicit type of layer instead of an explicit layer, explicit many layers. And not only that, these things are not just sort of nice theoretically, they also are very practical. They scale to sort of modern current vision tasks, and we are getting a much better handle on the theory of these things using the framework of monotone operators. So at a high level, I think this bodes well in some sense for the return of maybe shallow learning again, as long as you understand shallow learning to be shallow, implicit, very structured learning. And all these papers and code, including of course the MDEC and the monotone operator papers, will be available within a few days at my website. I want to thank again Xiaoji and Ezra, who are the main students that did all this work. Thanks very much.
Great, Zico, thank you for a really great talk. And yeah, that DEC model is a beautiful model with some very elegant results, which is nice to see. Once again, we've got some time for questions, so post questions to the chat or ask the questions. I've got one question I'll start with while people are sort of thinking about it. So you sort of answered my question about initialization of Z star with the uniqueness. So I guess initialization doesn't really matter. And as I said, it's a really nice, elegant model. So I wouldn't actually advocate for this, but I do want to ask the question of if you did just unroll the model to a certain depth,
yep,
right? So and you've got the weight tying, which is sort of regularizing your model. You now don't need to use implicit differentiation because you can just backpropagate through the unrolling. Yep. Do you sort of get similar results? Is it the weight tying that's giving you the good results, or is it really going to equilibrium?
It is really the depth. So if you truncate the networks at a earlier point than you sort of would get to by the fixed point, they don't work as well. So you really do need you really do benefit from the depth. And so I think in some ways, the way I think about this is that depth is less about kind of explicit hierarchy, and it's more about representational complexity of repeated nonlinearities. So the way I would sort of, hand wavily define it, right? And so with only like 5 layers or so, you just do not get the complexity you need to get that full sort of representational power. Now, you get some of it certainly, but it's not nearly as much. But you also pay a bigger memory cost, right? Because if you have to maintain all those different units in memory, and so it's not going to be quite as it's just not quite the right model in some sense, right? We really should be, I think, thinking about these things in terms of the implicit differentiation and the infinite depth limit, even if we don't actually attain the infinite depth limit in practice, right? Because there's always going to be some epsilon tolerance that we're finding fixed points to, but we still should be thinking about these things conceptually in terms of finding this infinite fixed point.
Right, so it's not even depth in that case, right? It's just finding the fixed point.
Well, I mean, right. So it's either shallow or it's infinitely deep, depending on your. So one of those two, right? It's either one layer or infinite layers, depending on.
Unbounded, right? Yeah.
There were 2 questions in the chat too. So Anoop asks, is the DEX compatible with SGD based training? So yeah, so everything we're doing here, there's no difference. We're still doing mini batches. We're still doing SGD. We're just computing the forward pass using this fixed point computation on a mini batch, doing SGD. Outer loop training is the same in every way. We use the same algorithms as everyone else uses. And then Sharath asks, how do you match the number of parameters for large networks? And you're absolutely right. So what we do is we just look at how big would you need to make a single layer in order to match the number of parameters, total parameters in the same, the explicit depth layers that we are comparing to. So you end up having bigger and wider single layers, but they are really, really wider in the case of vision, right? Because they're always the size of the image or whatever the scale you have is. We have wider, more channels in the layer, but we match the total number of parameters, and we're still more memory efficient because with number of parameters being matched, the number of channels or the size of the hidden unit still doesn't grow quite as fast as the number of parameters. So that's how we do that. And the next question is, how close does the convergence need to be in order for this differentiation to work? Which is also a great question, and it's something we push very hard at too, because the less we have to be precise, the better results we have for the same amount of computational time, right? So I believe that, the hand waving number here is as long as it's 0.01, the relative error of the convergence between one iteration to the next, z star minus f of z, f of z star, as long as that relative error there is like on the order of 10 to the -2, these things to work pretty well. Even I think the original deck paper, and we have a similar figure for the MDEC paper, we have figures for both of these things about the trade-off. The short answer is also that at training time, you need to be a little bit more precise than at test time, because of course at test time, you're not actually computing gradients, you're just trying to compute a fixed point. Someone asks, have you looked into representation learning with DEX? So I would argue that we, by doing deep learning, we are doing representation learning. Having said that, no, we have not examined the quality and the sort of the nature of the representations that we're learning at the different multi-scaled levels. I think we're really just starting out we're just getting started when it comes to building these models. And definitely some of the next steps we want to think about are how do we in fact think about and analyze whether these things learn something that's very similar to existing models in some sense, or whether they learn a very different representation than we have in existing models.
All right, I thought I saw a hand up.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, it was mine. So I have 2 questions, and I'm going to try to make them as clear as possible.
Sure.
So the first one is that I can see some sort of connection between DEC in general and the work of deep layers as stochastic solver, where the later showed that a single hidden layer can be shown that it's trying to solve some stochastic program.
Yep.
And if so, then the uniqueness theorem about the equilibrium point could it be generalized among any network just by putting some constraint about the linear layers?
Yeah, that's actually a pretty, there's a lot of conditions there. So a lot of that paper was looking at was just the nonlinearities themselves, right? Which is actually how we actually were referencing that when I mentioned sort of the prox nature of these layers. For the linear layers, it's a little bit trickier because these networks are actually not solutions to an optimization problem because W does not need to be symmetric. So if W was symmetric, so maybe go to this point here. Let's go up a few slides here. So if W actually is symmetric in this equation here, then it turns out that these layers are actually very similar to or identical. There's a correspondence to a quadratic program, which is actually very similar then to our OptNet work from a few years ago that solved quadratic programs as a layer, as well as a lot of other work. Steven and many others where we're looking at minimization, basically parameterized minimization things as we do declarative networks. So these things are only equivalent when W is symmetric. When it's non-symmetric, and you actually want W to have non-symmetries too in general, you don't want to constrain yourself to have that, then this does not correspond to the solution of any optimization problems, basically because the gradients, the Hessian is non-symmetric here. So there are a lot of subtleties there, which maybe are better described more than that offline. But there are connections. There are just also differences here.
Very well. The second question is that, have you tried to explore some sort of unexpected benefits from these deep equilibrium models? Because they seem to be harder in training, harder in doing inference, and not beating the state of the art by a quite big margin. So I assume that they should have some sort of unexpected benefits or some under hidden layer representations that are learned.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think so far we've been focused on the expected benefits, to put it bluntly, in that they're that they are performative with a single model against the current state of the art, with much less memory, right? So those are both kind of expected benefits. Well, I guess things we want to demonstrate. Period. In terms of sort of the maybe the question you kind of want to get at is why are these things better? And is there some interesting kind of explanation for why that is? The reality is that I don't think we've sort of answered that question in terms of analyzing the structure of things that's being learned and things like this. What are the representations that are being learned, as I mentioned before. What I would sort of say instead is that I would say that this calls into question the need for explicit depth at all. So I think it's been kind of a fundamental point that for some reason we sort of feel that depth is necessary for deep learning, right? For the power, for the complexity of representations we want to learn in modern machine learning, we feel that depth is necessary. And I think what this sort of says is that that's not true if you're defining this in terms of explicit depth. So it isn't about sort of the functional depth of the thing. It's much more about kind of the complexity of the computation itself in some sense than it is about explicit depth. And so I think that what our hope here is that we can actually get people starting to rethink the need for depth at all and the representations you have to get out, which is sort of thought to come only from depth, to start thinking about very different types of still very powerful models.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Thank you very much. Very interesting and wonderful presentation.
So I don't know how much more time we have, Stephen. I don't have too much more time.
So we'll take one more question from Richard Hartley. He the benefit of being in Australia is Richard texted me separately to say he's got a question. So we better let him ask.
Okay, thanks. Maybe you've sort of answered my question here, but I mean, I'm looking at this theorem about the single unique fixed point, and is this a major restriction? I mean, because most cases you'd sort of think there won't be a single fixed point in situations like this.
So right.
I also think of the Brouwer fixed point theorem, right, which also is which I'm sure you're aware of, which sort of explains in some sense why you have fixed points.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is a constructive proof, right? So it says like this is the fixed point. The fixed point satisfies this, and this is how you find it also. So it's a little it's a little bit nicer in that sense. But so it's a good question, right? It's a great question. Is do we want to have one fixed point or not? Maybe it's beneficial to have multiple fixed points. So and that's a totally reasonable statement in terms of kind of the notion of what we want out of a network. What I would say is, even though this statement is not true for MDEX, right, so which had much more complex functions, F here did not enforce a parameterization like this that would enforce monotonicity, that would guarantee a unique fixed point. Even for those, what we find in practice is the fixed points typically are unique. And Stephen, to answer your question, at initialization here, we usually just initialize them to be all 0. But if for an iterative method to find them, doesn't matter for obviously monotone operator versions, but it does matter for MDEX. But if we initialize it randomly too, it finds the same fixed point. So what I would say is, in some sense, explicit deep networks also have a unique fixed point, right? It's a deterministic computation that gives maps from input to output. And so it's unclear to me that you really lose that much representational power by forcing yourself to have a unique fixed point. I mean, and sometimes we sort of know that it isn't that big a deal because we always embed a normal deep network inside of this, which will have a unique fixed point. But even beyond that, it's really not clear to me that you really lose that much, as long as you have sort of a lot of width here and a lot of implicit depth, I guess. You're iterating enough here. As long as the function is complex enough, I think it's actually fine to have a unique fixed point. I haven't seen that as being a problem yet. And so I suspect it's not going to be an issue. But it is a great question to think about. Are we losing something fundamental because we're requiring these networks to have a unique fixed point? Is it somehow limiting, because, for example, monotone operators here are definitely much less powerful than arbitrary operators, right? You can solve fewer problems with them, whereas arbitrary operators like this, you actually can embed things like SAT solving, stuff like that, if you don't require monotonicity. So it's a great question. I just don't see evidence that the things we learn in practice would necessarily benefit from having multiple fixed points.
Well, I mean, if you have a multiple fixed point, right, and it depends on the input, and then a method which just sort of looks for fixed points by some sort of optimization method can come up with different values, right? And
but I think it's so also, I mean, this is just in the forward pass, right? So there's definitely, I mean, the outer loop optimization of solving for the weights and everything, that of course has all the same issues as normal deep learning. That is non-convex, multiple local optima, just as bad to optimize, right? Everything is the same, which is sort of seen as both a good positive and negative. This is just in terms of computing the equilibrium for the inference problem, not for the learning problem.
Okay. One last comment. I mean, I find a certain irony in this is a sort of a mathematical comment, for a certain irony in you saying this is a constructivist way of doing proof, in a sense, because the Brouwer fixed point theorem, which is a famous theorem, of fixed points, is basically not constructionist and led to the whole movement of constructionist mathematics, which is, I don't know if you're aware of that. But, and Brouwer himself didn't, in a sense, end up believing his own proof.
All right. Well. We're sort of well over time, so let's leave it there and thank Zico again for a wonderful talk.
Great, thanks so much. And I'll try to answer the people that I see outstanding in the chat as well. But I'll
if we could do that. All right, so let me just give some concluding remarks. I'll just get set up for that. Anyone else? Which screen am I sharing? The right one. Okay, so the sun's just risen in Australia. It's been a long night for us, but a very enjoyable workshop. So I just wanted to conclude by I guess putting up one view of sort of declarative networks, and Zico has actually given us another one with the DEC models. But this idea of sort of embedding optimization problems or some sort of richer implicit model within deep learning, I think is a really novel idea that people have been exploring more and more in recent years, and is the thing that sort of triggered this this workshop. And in order to be able to have these more sophisticated models inside deep networks and inside the processing nodes of these computation graphs, we need to be able to propagate gradients. We need to be able to understand the mapping from input to output and the reverse mapping from the gradient of the output back to the gradient of the input in order to learn these models. And so sort of abstracting up one level, we can sort of think of this as bi-level optimization. So the classic sort of learning problem is we want to minimize some objective subject to constraints over the variables in our model, which are typically the parameters of our deep network. And of course, what we can do is we can structure this as a bi-level problem where our objective at the upper level is not just the objective over the parameters of the model, but also an objective over a variable which is found by solving some lower level problem. When that lower level problem is an objective, an optimization problem is in a declarative node, then it's the argmin of that problem. But of course, we can sort of think about this in terms of the ideas that Zico presented as well, and meta-learning and other ideas. So this sort of workshop was, I guess, the first step at trying to bring these ideas together under a common umbrella, where instead of just having these very explicit, simple processing functions that are put together into deep learning, we tried to bring together some more sort of classic ideas from computer vision, from economics, from machine learning, where we start looking at models and understanding things in terms of models, and then embedding those models within deep learning. And so those models can be optimization models, they can be fixed point models, they can enforce constraints, and have implicit representations and so on. This workshop wouldn't have been a success without the invited speakers and the authors who presented their papers. So I'd really like to thank all of the speakers, so Brandon, Ricky, Chelsea, Pascal, Supransu, and Zico, as well as the authors of the papers who gave orals and the posters. All of the talks have been recorded and will be put online. You can get to those from the website. The papers are online as well, and also to the audience. Of course, the whole point of a workshop is for people who are interested in similar ideas to get together and chat about those ideas. It's been an experiment doing this virtually. I think there are a few things we've learned, but by and large, it's been a great success. So thank you, everyone. And once again, here's the URL for the workshop website, where all of the material will be available after the workshop. So I'll leave it open now for anybody who's got any sort of final comments.
Let me just I just want to, so as not to miss the opportunity of saying this, I just want to thank my co-organizers here, right, who sacrificed by staying up all night, which I'm afraid I did not, but I'm very much looking forward to hearing the talks which I haven't heard second time around here. So thanks for that.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, everyone. So I think if I close the session now, we'll lose the chat window. So I guess if Zico hasn't answered any of the questions that are still outstanding, you can perhaps email him separately.
Trying to get to all of them, but maybe not. I think so far we're good, but.
Okay, good. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. If you have friends who've missed any of the talks or sessions, we will be repeating them starting. Oh, I don't know. It's going to be 2 p.m. Australian time. That I guess translates into 9 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. You can work out the rest of the time zones. So the poster presenters will be online. All of the other talks will be pre-recorded talks. All right. Thank you, and yeah, have a good day, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.